Under a sky washed pale as old bone, the world awakens slowly. Not with brilliance, not with warmth, but with a hesitant glow, as though morning itself is unsure it should arrive. The sun rises without voice or certainty, suspended above the earth like a forgotten name, on the edge of memory. Its light spreads thinly, barely touching the fields, barely stirring the stone villages that wait beneath it. Shadows linger far too long, stretching into the heart of the day, refusing to retreat when they should. And in that lingering, something ancient feels unsettled. It is said there was a year when daylight felt borrowed. People stepped from their homes and paused, hands resting on doorframes worn smooth by generations. They looked upward, not in fear, but in quiet recognition that something sacred had shifted. The sky was still there, the sun was still visible, and yet the warmth that once carried promise no longer reached the skin. Breath rose in soft clouds, even at noon. The air held no seasonal memory. In forgotten corners of the earth, this realization spread without words. No messengers were sent, no proclamations were made. It moved instead through glances exchanged in silence, through the way fires were kept burning longer than usual, through the slow hesitation of footsteps in fields that should have been alive with growth. Chronicles from distant lands speak of this time with careful restraint. They do not shout, they whisper. They describe a sun that shone without strength, a sky that glimmered but did not bless. Summers arrived without fullness, as if dressed in mourning. Winters loosened their grip reluctantly, and spring walked the earth like a visitor uncertain of its welcome. Beneath the silence, the earth itself seemed to breathe differently. Farmers felt it first in the soil. Seeds were pressed into ground that felt colder than it should have been, deeper than memory allowed. The familiar dialogue between hand and earth faltered. Where life once answered faithfully, there was now only patience. Fields lay still, not dead, not barren, but waiting in a way that felt heavy with uncertainty. It is said the land did not refuse to give. It simply paused. Grain rose thin and hesitant, stopping short of abundance. Leaves unfurled smaller than remembered. Fruit hardened before sweetness could reach it. The rhythm that had guided generations faltered, as though the seasons themselves had forgotten the order of their steps. And yet no one named this as disaster. It arrived like ash, soft, drifting, settling slowly into every corner of life. Meals grew simpler without discussion. Bread was cut thinner, silence lengthened between words, hunger moved quietly, not as a scream, but as a gradual hollowing. Above it all, the sun remained, always present, always distant, always veiled. Some believed that far beyond the horizon, a great disturbance had risen. Dust or smoke lifted into the upper air, drifting into the hidden chambers where light travels. Others whispered of celestial wounds, unseen scars across the heavens that dulled the sun's face. Still others spoke in reverent tones of veils drawn gently across the sky, not in anger, but in reminder. But no one truly knew, because the veil, if it existed, could not be pointed to or touched. It was everywhere, in the muted color of the day, in the cold breath of mornings that should have been warm, in the way shadows refused to shrink. Birdsong thinned, not vanished entirely, but altered, as though even sound sensed the need for restraint. Mornings passed with fewer voices, the air holding space where melodies once lived. The wind moved through trees like a question unanswered. Time itself felt different. Days stretched, not with activity, but with waiting. Hours carried weight. The future felt closer, yet harder to imagine. Calendars lost authority as seasons blurred into one another. People measured life by firewood and grain, by light and dark, by endurance. In distant halls of stone, empires continued to stand. Laws were written, coins exchanged hands, roads remained open. But beneath banners and marble ceilings, the same quiet understanding settled in. Power could not command the sun. Authority could not summon warmth. Even the grandest structures rested silently on the faithfulness of light. In temples and humble homes alike, prayers softened, voices lowered, requests became whispers, silence itself became sacred. It is said that elders began to speak of ancient cycles, of years buried deep within memory when the world dimmed and later returned. Stories were shared not to frighten, but to steady the heart. Because stories, like embers, offer warmth even when the fire burns low. Children born beneath that pale sky learned a gentler light. Their first memories were of soft days and quiet seasons. For them, this dimness was not loss, but normal. They did not mourn what they had never known, and perhaps that is how the world endured. Adaptation moved quietly, like roots growing deeper into colder soil. Life adjusted without ceremony. Humanity bent, but did not break. As the year unfolded, something subtle began to change, not suddenly, not dramatically. The light steadied. For brief moments the air softened. Shadows pulled back just enough to suggest that the veil was thinning. No one celebrated. Trust, once shaken, returned slowly. The harvest did not fully recover, nor did certainty return whole. But the earth relaxed, almost imperceptibly, as though it sensed that forgetting was giving way to remembrance. When warmth returned, it did not arrive in triumph. It came like memory, gentle, familiar, fragile. And still, the year remained etched into the soul of those who lived through it. They carried forward a quiet knowing that light is a gift, not a possession, that seasons are promises but promises can falter, that the world is held together by forces both generous and unknowable. Long after skies cleared, the echo lingered, in songs sung slower, in grain stored more carefully, in eyes lifted upward, even in good years. And so we return to that pale landscape beneath the thin sky. The sun hangs there, present, restrained, remembering. The land waits, patient, enduring. The world breathes, slowly, deliberately. Perhaps the sun never truly forgot its name. Perhaps it simply went quiet, reminding the earth how to listen. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be lived through, carried gently, and released only in silence. And now, as your own breath slows, as thoughts soften and drift like dust through moonlit air, that ancient half-light settles around you. Not as fear, not as loss, but as a hush. A reminder that even the sun may pause, that waiting has its own sacred rhythm, and that some years, marked by shadow and stillness, end not with answers, but with reverence. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some stories, like sleep itself, arrive quietly, and ask nothing more than your trust. Beneath a sky scattered with distant stars, there begins a falling that no one can see. Not snow, not rain, not anything the hands can catch. It is said that on certain nights long ago, the air itself carried a weight. A fine, unseen dust drifted downward through moonlight, passing silently between constellations, settling into valleys, cities, and lungs without sound. No one watched it fall, no one heard it arrive. And yet by morning, the world felt altered, softened, muted, as if wrapped in a thin veil. This is where the story begins. Not with fire, but with ash. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, in places no traveler could reach in time, mountains may have spoken in flame. The earth may have split open, releasing ancient breath that had waited beneath stone since the first shaping of the world. But here, where people lived and slept and prayed, there was no thunder, no red sky, no trembling ground, only a sky that would not clear. In forgotten corners of the earth, dawn arrived pale and uncertain. The sun rose behind a faint haze that dulled its edges, making its light appear distant, as though it were shining from memory rather than presence. Clouds did not move as they should. The blue of the heavens thinned into something fragile, something easily broken. Whispers tell us that no one understood what they were seeing. The air smelled no different. The ground looked unchanged, and yet there was a sense, deep and instinctive, that something had entered the world quietly, crossing borders no empire could guard. Ash, after all, is a traveler. It does not need roads or ships. It moves with the breath of the sky. It crosses seas without knowing their names. It drifts above forests and deserts alike, above temples and markets, above sleeping children and burning lamps. It moves through time as easily as it moves through space, settling not just on soil, but on memory. It is said that the ash carried no warning, only a long shadow. Days passed, and the light grew strange, not dark enough to alarm, not bright enough to comfort. Shadows softened, colors faded. Even the stars, when night came, seemed sharper, as though the darkness had gained clarity while the day had lost it. In scattered testimonies, etched on tablets, written in careful ink, spoken aloud beside low fires, people began to record what they felt rather than what they saw. They spoke of suns that dimmed without clouds, of cold winds arriving too early, of summers that never ripened. Fields grew hesitant. Crops rose thin and pale, then stopped. Fruit hardened before sweetness could find it. The land seemed to pause mid-breath, unsure whether it was safe to continue. Beneath the silence, ash gathered its meaning, not as destruction, but as suspension. Some believe the ash was the breath of the earth held too long, a reminder that the world, like all living things, can inhale and forget to release. Others believed it was a scar left by distant fire, a wound so far away that only its shadow reached them. But ash does not explain itself, it simply arrives. It coats memory the way it coats stone, softening edges, blurring certainty. People struggled to recall when exactly the change had begun. There was no single moment to point to, no line in time where the world clearly shifted. It was everywhere, all at once, and nowhere visible. In cities built of marble and dust, fires burned lower. Wood cracked differently, as if the flame itself felt restrained. In temples, incense hung longer in the air, unwilling to rise. Voices softened, words felt heavier. Prayer and silence began to share the same chamber. It is said that some nights the moon appeared haloed, circled by a faint ring, as though marked by something unseen. The stars shimmered through a thin film, distant and sharp, like memories viewed through tears. Children noticed first, though they did not know how to speak of it. They asked why the sun felt tired, why the air felt heavy, why the world sounded quieter. Elders answered with stories. They spoke of ancient cycles, of times when the sky itself carried burdens, of years when the earth was asked to wait. Because ash teaches patience, it settles slowly, it leaves slowly, and while it lingers, it changes how the world listens. In far-off lands, where no smoke could be seen and no flame remembered, rulers puzzled over failing harvests and restless skies. Messengers carried reports that contradicted one another. Some spoke of cold, others of drought, others of dim light with no clear cause. The truth lay between them, suspended like dust in the upper air. Was this a single moment, or many wounds overlapping in time? No one could say, because ash does not fall evenly. It drifts. It gathers in some places and spares others. It moves with currents invisible to those beneath it. And so the experience of the year, or the years, varied like dreams. Some remembered it as a long twilight, others as a quiet famine, others still as a spiritual hush that wrapped the world like linen. What united them was not fear, but uncertainty, a sense that something vast had passed overhead, leaving only its echo behind. It is said that during this time itself felt altered. Days stretched thin, seasons overlapped. The future felt close but unreachable, like a path obscured by fog. People adapted without ceremony. Meals became simpler, fires burned longer. Life bent inward, conserving warmth, conserving hope. Ash teaches restraint. It reminds the world that light is delicate, that warmth travels a long way to reach us, that even the sun depends on clear passage through the sky. And then, slowly, quietly, something shifted. Not an ending, not a resolution, just a change in breath. The haze thinned in certain hours. The sun steadied, if only slightly. The air softened enough to be noticed. Shadows sharpened again, finding their proper places. No one announced the change, because after living beneath a veiled sky, trust returns carefully. The ash did not vanish. It never truly does. It rose, thinned, scattered, remaining suspended between sky and soil, between memory and forgetting. Some of it settled into ice far from where it was born, some into oceans, some into the lungs of history itself, and there it stayed. Long after the sky cleared, people remembered the feeling more than the cause. They remembered the way the world had gone quiet, the way light had faltered, the way prayer had become softer, more inward. They carried that memory forward, embedding it into stories, into caution, into reverence, because ash does not only darken, it also preserves. It seals moments in stillness. It teaches the earth how to pause. It reminds humanity that change does not always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it drifts, sometimes it waits. And so, in the final reflection, the ash still floats, neither fully fallen nor gone, neither visible nor forgotten. It rests in the upper air of memory, reminding us how fragile light can be, how easily the world can shift while we are listening for something else. Perhaps the fire that birthed it was never meant to be seen. Perhaps the cause was less important than the lesson, that the earth listens, that the sky carries secrets, that even silence leaves traces. And now, as your own breath slows, as thought softens and begins to spiral inward, imagine that fine dust drifting gently above you, not heavy, not threatening, just present, a reminder that the world is always changing, quietly, patiently, while we sleep beneath the stars. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some changes, like ash in the upper air, are felt long before they are understood. The sky remains, the dust lingers, and the story fades, softly, into silence. A field waits at dawn, not frozen, not broken, not covered in white, only waiting. The grass holds a thin silver of dew, and the horizon is washed in the first delicate light. Everything looks as it should. The earth is still here, the sky still opens above it. The sun begins to rise with gentle patience, laying a pale ribbon across the land. And yet something is missing, no flutter of wings, no bright thread of birdsong. The air is cold in a way that feels wrong, cold not like winter's honest bite, but like a quiet mistake, the kind of chill that does not belong to morning in summer. It slips beneath the collar, into the breath, and leaves a question resting on the tongue. It is said there was a summer without birds, not that every wing vanished from the world. No story is that clean, but the familiar chorus, the steady rhythm that marks the dawn, fell away. The fields did not ring with life, the trees did not answer the light. The day opened in silence, as if the world had forgotten the part of itself that sings. In forgotten corners of the earth, people woke and listened. At first, they waited for the sound to return, the way one waits for a kettle to begin its soft murmuring. They tilted their heads. They stood in doorways and let the morning air touch their faces. They looked up into branches and along fence lines, expecting to see small bodies shifting, to hear the quick, bright notes that usually stitch the day together. But the branches were still. Even the wind seemed unsure how to move. Whispers tell us that absence has a shape. It is not empty, it is not nothing, it is a presence all its own. That summer, the silence felt like a veil drawn carefully across the land. Not harshly, not violently, more like a curtain in a sacred chamber, pulled closed so gently that no one notices the moment it begins. In villages built of stone and wood, people spoke of it quietly. They did not call it a curse. They did not rush to name it as omen. They only noticed how the mornings had changed, how the day began without its usual blessing. Because birds, in the deep language of memory, are not only animals, they are messengers. They are the living ink with which the sky writes its moods. They carry the rhythm of seasons in their throats. They remind the earth that it is still turning, and so, when their voices dimmed, something inside the human heart dimmed with them. As the days passed, the quiet did not lift. The fields remained strangely restrained. The air stayed cooler than it should, even under the sun. Summer arrived, but it arrived without confidence, like a traveler who has lost the map and continues forward only because stopping would feel worse. Crops struggled, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough for people to notice, enough for the old ones who carried the memory of many seasons to feel a slow tightening in their chests. Seeds were pressed into soil with hope, and hope rose briefly, then faltered. Green shoots appeared thin and hesitant. Grain did not thicken the way it should. Fruit did not swell into sweetness. It was as if the land had begun to ration its generosity, and animals wandered oddly, as if some hidden compass had turned inside them. Sheep lingered at the edge of pastures, staring into open distance. Dogs barked at nothing, and then fell quiet. Even insects seemed fewer, their soft buzzing reduced to scattered fragments. Beneath the silence, the world felt held, like breath held too long. Some believe the birds left because the cold arrived early, because the air shifted in ways delicate bodies could not tolerate. Others believe it was hunger that drove them, a thinning of insects and seeds, a quiet collapse of small food chains that usually remain unseen. But there were those who whispered something softer, stranger. They whispered that the sky itself had changed, that the light carried a different taste, that the winds brought unfamiliar signals, that something subtle had been written into the celestial chamber, and the birds, those ancient listeners, had read it before anyone else. It is said that birds know things the ground cannot. They feel pressure before storms. They sense migrations hidden in the air. They move by star-marked instinct, guided by pathways humans cannot see. So when the birds grew silent, the question was not only, where have they gone? The deeper question was, what did they hear? In the evenings, people gathered near low fires and spoke in careful tones, not to frighten one another, but to try to place a hand on the shape of the mystery. They spoke of old summers, old stories, old warnings whispered by grandparents who had watched the world change before. They spoke of years when the sun felt weak, of seasons that arrived out of order, of strange dust in the air that softened daylight. And always someone would mention the birds, because birds are the first to leave when the world turns uncertain, and their leaving feels like a door closing. In some places, priests and storytellers tried to offer comfort. They spoke of silence as sacred, as a pause before renewal. They said that nature sometimes retreats into itself the way a person retreats into prayer. They said the earth might simply be resting. But when you live inside the silence, rest can feel like grief. Days continued to unfold, slow and pale. Morning after morning, the field waited at dawn, still untouched by frost, yet emptied of song. The sky brightened, and the world remained quiet, as if the sunrise had lost its companion. People began to notice how the silence changed them. They walked more softly. They spoke less. They listened more. A small absence has a way of making everything else louder, the creak of a wooden gate, the distant call of a dog, the rustle of leaves, the thud of a footstep in soil. Without birdsong, the world revealed its deeper layers. And in those layers, the human spirit became tender, because in the great theatre of nature, birds are the gentle music that assures us the play is still ongoing. When that music fades, you begin to wonder whether the stage itself has shifted. Some believe the summer without birds was part of a larger forgetting, a time when seasons lost their promises and the earth moved through a long uncertainty. Not just one summer, but a span of years when warmth and growth faltered, when skies held strange haze and the rhythm of life stumbled. But history, like dream, is not always precise. It arrives as fragments, a note in a chronicle, a line in a letter, a whispered memory carried through generations. And in those fragments we find the same tender image repeating across lands, a morning without song. The symbolism gathers gently around it, birds as messengers, silence as omen, the earth holding its breath. Yet the tone remains calm, never alarming, because the mystery is not a monster, it is a veil. Something life has stepped behind, and the human heart stands at the edge of that veil, looking inward, listening for a sound that does not come. Was it only cold that drove them away? Or was there something deeper, something written in wind and starlight, something sensed by wings and instinct long before it reached human understanding? No one could say. Because absence does not leave footprints, it leaves only a hollow space in the pattern of things. As the summer leaned toward its later days, twilight arrived early, not in clock time, but in feeling. Evenings felt heavier. The sky's colors seemed muted, as if painted with watered ink. People watched the horizon. They looked for returning wings, for a single bright flutter that might announce the world remembers itself again. Sometimes there were glimpses, a distant shape crossing the sky, a single call, faint and uncertain, from deep within trees. But it was never enough to stitch the world back into its old certainty. It was like hearing one note of a song you once loved and realizing how much of the melody has been lost. And then, slowly, inevitably, the season turned. Autumn approached with quiet steadiness. The fields browned, leaves began their soft surrender, the air grew cooler, now honest in its chill. Winter prepared its deep chambers, and still the birds did not fully return, not as they had been. Twilight settled over the land like a blessing and a farewell at once. The villages lit lamps. Fires glowed behind windows. The earth held its silence close. In that silence, people began to accept something without understanding it, that nature too can grieve, that the world has rhythms we depend on, and when those rhythms falter, we feel it in our bones. Even the smallest absences can echo through generations like a half-remembered song. Because a summer without birds is not only about birds. It is about the fragile thread of belonging, about the way sound makes us feel safe, about the quiet trust we place in dawn to arrive with music. And when that music fades, we learn to listen differently. Perhaps it was never meant to be explained. Perhaps the birds went where the veil is thin, where the air speaks more clearly, where the earth's hidden currents guide them beyond human knowing. Or perhaps they were simply waiting, the way the land was waiting, paused in a sacred stillness until the world became familiar again. We do not receive answers. We receive only the field at dawn and its silence. And now, as your own breathing slows, as the edges of thought soften and begin to drift, let that silence become gentle rather than heavy. Not a warning, not a fear, a quiet chamber of listening, marked by the moon, washed in starlight, held in sacred uncertainty. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some summers, silent, veiled and strange, do not end with explanations. They end with twilight, and the soft, dreamlike understanding that even silence is part of the world's ancient song. Hands move through soil the way one might search through ashes for a forgotten ember, slowly, carefully, as if the earth could be hurt by impatience. The ground is dark, but it does not feel alive. It is cool even under the faint sun, cool in a way that seems to come from deeper than weather. Fingers lift a small handful and let it fall, grain by grain, back into its own cradle. The soil does not crumble with warmth. It slips through the palm like dust from an ancient wall. And in that quiet motion, a question rises without words. It is said there were years when the land refused to answer, years when seeds were pressed into the earth with hope that grew thinner each season. Hope stretched like a worn cloth, still held, still cherished, but no longer trusted to hold forever. The hands that sowed were not careless. They knew their rituals. They had learned the timing of rains, the language of winds, the way the sun should lean at certain months. They did everything as they always had, and still the grain would not grow. In forgotten corners of the earth, villages woke to mornings that felt unfinished. There was light, but it came pale and distant. The air carried a muted chill, even when it should have softened. People walked to their fields as if walking into a temple, quietly, with lowered voices, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile patience of the world. The seeds were precious now. Each one felt like a small oath, a small prayer, a promise folded into the palm. They were placed into furrows with gentle care. Soil was drawn over them like a blanket. And then the waiting began. Not the ordinary waiting of spring, bright with confidence, but a deeper waiting, heavy with uncertainty, as if time itself had become cautious. Days passed, then weeks, and the earth offered little. It is said that hunger arrived not like a storm, but like a shadow sliding across the floor. No sirens, no shouting, no sudden collapse, just the slow, hollowing presence that moved from house to house, village to village, like something that did not want to be seen. It arrived as smaller meals, as thinner bread, as a quiet loosening of belts. It arrived in the careful way people began to measure grain, counting kernels as if counting heartbeats. At first, there were explanations. Perhaps the rain had been wrong. Perhaps the frost had lingered. Perhaps the soil needed rest. But as seasons turned and the same silence returned, explanations began to feel like smoke, thin, drifting, unable to hold shape. Whispers tell us that granaries stood emptier than they should have. Great wooden doors were opened to reveal space where abundance once lived. The scent of stored grain, warm, sweet, comforting, was replaced by a hollow dryness. People stood inside those rooms and listened to the echo of their own breathing, as if the building itself remembered what it had once held. And bread, that ancient comfort, became rare, not absent entirely, but transformed, no longer the everyday companion of life, but something precious, something saved. A slice offered to the sick, a crust shared between children, a loaf broken carefully, not with celebration, but with reverence. In those years, the simplest foods carried the weight of ceremony. Beneath the silence, contradiction hummed like a distant drum. Empires still stood. There were still banners on stone walls, still laws written in ink, still coins passing from hand to hand. Traders still moved along roads, kings still held councils, temples still lifted prayers toward the heavens. And yet, in the shadow of that structure, people weakened quietly. It is a strange thing how a civilization can appear whole while the bodies within it grow thin, how marble halls can remain intact while fields falter. The world above ground looked strong. The world beneath, where roots and hunger and breath live, told another story. And so the grain became more than grain. It became a symbol of trust broken between earth and sky. Because for countless generations, the cycle had been sacred, seed to soil, soil to sprout, sprout to harvest. It was not just agriculture, it was a covenant, a quiet agreement between the human hand and the living ground. To plant was to believe, to harvest was to be answered. But when the harvest did not come, faith did not vanish. It turned inward. It grew quieter, more personal, more delicate. In some homes, people prayed without words. They sat near low fires and listened to the soft crack of wood, as if the flame might speak. They watched the smoke rise and disappear, carrying their hopes into a sky that felt distant. In others, people held small rituals, a handful of grain placed on a windowsill as an offering, a candle lit at dusk for the fields, a whispered name spoken into the soil before sleep. Not grand ceremonies, not desperate acts, just small gestures of devotion stitched into daily life like thread into cloth. Because when you have little, you become careful with everything, even hope. The atmosphere of those years was not loud. It was hushed and intimate. There was no roaring famine in this telling, no chaos painted in bright strokes. Instead, there was the soft counting of remaining loaves, the quiet sharing of what warmth remained, the careful way families gathered close at night, as if closeness itself could become a kind of nourishment. Children learned not to waste, not through scolding, but through observation. They watched adults measure flour with solemn hands. They watched mothers scrape bowls clean. They watched fathers stare into fields that should have been green, their faces held still as stone. And still, life continued. People mended clothing, they carried water, they swept floors. They told stories, because even when grain will not grow, the human spirit searches for ways to endure. Some believe the years of failing harvest were tied to a veiling of the sky. Dust or ash lifted into the upper air, softening the sun, cooling the world. Others speak of strange seasons, of summers that felt like morning, of winters that refused to fully release their hold. But these are only threads, and the past is a woven cloth with missing pieces. We know the feeling more than the facts, a world where the sun felt faint, where fields hesitated, where hunger moved like quiet smoke, where survival became an ancient ritual of patience. In certain places, the land offered small mercies, a patch of barley that rose unexpectedly, a tree that bore fruit in defiance of the cold, a late harvest that came like a shy gift. These moments were not enough to erase the hardship, but enough to keep devotion alive, enough to remind people that the earth had not abandoned them entirely. It was simply struggling to speak. And so, the act of planting remained. Even when hope was thin, hands still pressed seeds into soil. Because to stop planting would be to surrender the future completely. To stop planting would be to admit that the covenant was broken beyond repair. And humans, even in quiet suffering, resist that kind of surrender. They plant because planting is belief made physical. They plant because the body needs food, but the soul needs meaning. As the chapter deepens, imagine the granary again, its emptiness echoing. Imagine a village at dusk, smoke rising from chimneys, not thick and joyful, but thin and careful. Imagine a table with fewer loaves, hands passing pieces with tenderness, not counting out loud, but counting in the mind. Beneath the silence, each day becomes a small devotion. Wake, work, share, wait. And then toward the end, where memory fades into dream, we come to a single seed. One seed, small as a fingernail, lying dormant in frozen soil. It has no voice, no certainty, no promise. It rests in darkness, surrounded by cold earth that may or may not soften again. Above it, the sky holds its pale light. The seasons turn with fragile reluctance, and the seed waits. Perhaps it will rise. Perhaps it will remain buried. Perhaps the world will warm and the soil will open like a gate. Perhaps it will not. This is the sacred uncertainty the chapter leaves us with. Patience stretched thin. Devotion tested quietly. Survival not as heroism, but as steady endurance. Because to survive such years is not only to eat, it is to keep believing, softly, stubbornly, that the earth might remember its ancient rhythm. It is said that some acts are prayers even when no words are spoken, a hand covering a seed with soil, a crust shared in silence, a fire kept alive through a cold noon, a family breathing together in the same room, letting warmth pass from one body to another. And now, as your own breath slows, as thought begins to drift like dust in moonlit air, let that single seed remain in your mind, not as despair, not as fear, but as a quiet symbol of the human heart, small, buried, waiting. Perhaps it was never meant to be known whether it would rise. Perhaps the meaning was always in the waiting. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some seeds, hidden in dark soil, carry their own sacred timing, unfolding not by force, but by the slow, patient mercy of the world. The bell of noon has already passed. The sun stands high in the sky, balanced above the world as it always has, yet something is wrong. The light falls straight down, pale and unwavering, but it brings no comfort. It touches stone and earth without warmth, like a memory of heat rather than heat itself. In the open square, people pause mid-step, their breath briefly visible, blooming into the air and fading again. At midday, breath should not be seen, and yet, here it is. It is said there were days when noon felt like dawn, days when the sun climbed faithfully to its highest place, but the air refused to follow. Time kept its promise, but warmth did not. The world continued its slow turning, hour after hour, while something essential lagged behind, as if lost along the way. In forgotten corners of the earth, this contradiction settled gently without announcement. Markets opened, bells rang, work continued. But everywhere, cloaks remained wrapped close. Hands were rubbed together for warmth that should not have been missing. Fires burned quietly in hearths that should have been empty by this hour. The cold did not rush. It lingered. It moved like a presence, steady, patient, almost attentive. It did not bite or punish. It simply stayed, watching the world move beneath a dim sky. Whispers tell us that ancient observers noticed it first in their bodies, the way fingers stiffened even under sunlight, the way stone walls felt hollow and cool when touched, the way water drawn from wells held an edge of cold long after sunrise. They spoke of light without heat, of a sun stripped of its strength. Scrolls from distant lands, written in careful script, described days that looked whole but felt incomplete. The sun shines, one account notes softly, yet it does not warm. Another speaks of shadows that should have fled by noon but lingered, stretched thin and unmoving. No one wrote of panic, they wrote of confusion, because fear announces itself loudly, but confusion arrives like fog, quiet, disorienting, everywhere at once. It seeps into the spaces between thoughts. It turns certainty into something fragile. Beneath the silence, the world began to breathe differently. People noticed their own breath more often, the small cloud it formed before dissolving, the shared exhale between strangers passing in the street. Breath became visible proof that the air itself had changed, and so breath became a symbol, the breath of the earth, cooling, the breath of humanity, shared, the breath of endurance, steady and quiet. In fields beyond the city walls, the same contradiction unfolded. Farmers worked beneath the open sky, the sun bright above them, yet the ground remained reluctant. Soil stayed cool beneath the surface. Dew lingered longer than it should. Plants grew, but slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether they were welcome. Animals sensed it too. Cattle huddled closer together. Sheep grazed without wandering far. Even insects seemed fewer. Their movements slowed, their buzzing reduced to faint echoes in the air. The cold did not shout its presence. It whispered. Some believe the cold breath of noon was borne far away, lifted into the upper air by forces unseen. Dust or ash, scattered so finely it softened the sun's reach without dimming its face. Others spoke of celestial imbalance, of shifts written into the higher chambers of the sky, beyond human sight. But most did not speculate loudly. They felt, they adapted, they endured. Because the cold, for all its persistence, was not cruel. It did not destroy outright. It asked something quieter of the world. Patience. At midday, fires burned low but steady, not roaring, not desperate, just present. Their smoke rose thinly, spiraling into the pale light as if offering a question upward. In temples and homes alike, people gathered closer. Work slowed not from laziness, but from care. Hands lingered over simple tasks. Words were spoken more thoughtfully. Silence grew sacred. It is said that in those days, prayer changed shape. It became less about asking and more about listening, less about summoning warmth and more about understanding its absence. The cold breath of noon felt intentional to some, not as punishment, as invitation, as if the world were being asked to endure without complaint, to remember something ancient about balance. That light and life are not guaranteed companions, that even the sun, ancient and celestial, depends on delicate pathways to reach the earth. In great cities, life continued beneath banners and stone arches. Authority remained intact. Laws were enforced. But beneath the visible order, people carried the same quiet unease. How long can light remain without warmth? How long can the world live in this in-between? Yet these questions did not demand answers. They hovered gently, like dust caught in a shaft of pale sunlight. Beneath the silence, time itself seemed altered. Noon arrived as expected, but it no longer felt like the heart of the day. It felt like a pause, a holding of breath, a moment suspended between what should be and what was. Children noticed first that play felt different. They ran, but tired more quickly. They laughed, but returned indoors sooner. Their elders watched them carefully, wrapping them in extra layers, whispering reassurances that sounded more like hope than certainty. And still, the sun slipped westward. Unchanged. It offered no apology, no explanation, only its steady presence, stripped of comfort. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the cold did not lift. It simply deepened, as if acknowledging the approaching night. Fires were fed again. Doors were closed earlier. The world drew inward, and when sunset came, it came beautifully. The sky burned with color, rose, amber, violet, so vivid it almost felt like mockery. How could such beauty hold such chill? How could the heavens glow so richly while the earth below remained cold? It is said that this contrast stayed with people longer than the cold itself. The memory of warmth withheld, the image of light that did not nourish. Night followed, and with it deeper cold, but night was expected. Night belonged to chill. It was noon that troubled the soul, the moment when warmth should have been assured. As the stars emerged, sharp and clear, the world exhaled together. Another day endured, another cycle completed. The cold breath remained. Through waking, through working, through sleep, it became a companion of sorts, unwelcome yet familiar, a reminder carried in every visible breath, every chilled stone, every fire kept burning too long. Some believe the cold breath of noon marked a turning in human memory, a lesson learned without words. That survival is not always dramatic, that endurance is often quiet, that the balance between light and life is far more delicate than it appears. Others believe it was simply a season, a strange alignment of forces that passed as all things do. But belief matters less than experience, and the experience was this: a sun that shone faithfully, a world that waited patiently, a cold that asked for humility. As the chapter closes, the sun slips away again, sinking toward the horizon without having changed its nature. The day ends as it began, pale, restrained, unresolved. The cold breath remains, drifting gently into evening, into night, into sleep. It rests beside the listener now, not as threat, but as reminder. That warmth is a gift, that balance is fragile, that endurance is sacred. Perhaps it was never meant to be explained. Perhaps the world was simply asked to remember how to wait. And as your own breath slows, as the edges of thought soften and begin to fade, imagine that cold breath, not sharp, not harsh, just present, steady, watchful. A companion through waking and dreaming, marked by the moon, veiled beneath stars, held in quiet reverence. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And some lessons arrive not in fire or storm, but in the gentle, persistent cold of a sunlit noon, asking nothing more than patience as sleep finally comes. Stone cities rise beneath a sky that has lost its color. At dawn, their walls catch the light, but the light does not linger. It slips across marble and limestone without blessing them, leaving surfaces pale and cool, as if the sun itself has grown distant from what it illuminates. Towers still cast long shadows, gates still open at first light, banners stir in the morning air, their fabrics whispering old loyalties. Everything appears intact, and yet something vital has thinned. It is said there were years when the greatest cities of the world stood tall beneath a weakened sun, years when order remained visible, when laws were still spoken aloud in courtyards, when guards still changed shifts and scribes still bent over scrolls. From a distance, the empires looked whole, but the air carried a quiet wrongness. In forgotten corners of the earth, travelers approaching these cities felt it before they understood it. The roads were still paved, the milestones still marked distance, but the warmth that once welcomed the body did not arrive. Breath showed faintly even at midday. Stone felt colder than memory allowed. The sky above was pale, not clouded, not darkened, simply thinned, as if something had been lifted from it, as if the heavens were present, but withholding. Beneath this sky, power continued. Kings sat on thrones carved from ancient rock. Councils gathered in chambers echoing with footsteps and history. Decrees were written in steady hands, sealed with wax, sent outward along familiar routes. Yet each decision felt heavier, slower, as though thought itself had begun to move through colder air. Whispers tell us that those who ruled sensed the change, even if they could not name it. They lingered longer over matters of grain and tax. They questioned messengers more closely. They stared out through high windows at the pale horizon, searching for signs that would not come, because the sky does not argue, it watches. In the halls of power, voices still rose and fell, but conviction softened. Ambition remained, yet it no longer burned cleanly. It flickered, constrained by something vast and impersonal overhead. Histories from this time conflict. On parchment, strength appears undiminished. Victories are recorded. Borders are described as stable. Tributes continue to flow. The language of empire remains confident, but beneath the silence, another history breathes. Fields outside the walls struggle. Grain grows thin. Harvests arrive late and light. The earth does not fail entirely, it hesitates, and that hesitation ripples inward, from farms to markets, from markets to treasuries, from treasuries to thrones. Stone can endure much, but stone cannot eat. It is said that in these years, granaries beneath great cities stood less full than they should have been. Their doors opened to reveal space, clean, echoing space where abundance once rested. Officials counted reserves carefully, their tallies written in quiet ink. No panic followed, not yet. Instead, restraint entered the language of rule. Plans were delayed, campaigns postponed, festivals shortened. The empire adjusted subtly, as living things do when the seasons shift against expectation. The pale sky bore witness to all of it. Above domes and spires, above temples and fortresses, it remained unchanged. It did not darken into threat. It did not brighten into reassurance. It simply held its distant light, indifferent to banners and borders alike. In temples, priests lit candles and watched the flames lean slightly, as if pulled by unseen currents. Incense rose in thin spirals, lingering longer than before, refusing to disperse. Prayer took on a quieter tone, not less devout but more inward. Faith, like power, felt the thinning, because faith too depends on rhythm, on seasons arriving when promised, on sun and rain answering ancient expectation, on the quiet agreement between heaven and earth. And when that agreement falters, belief turns contemplative. In forgotten corners of the cities, among artisans and traders and children playing in narrow streets, the pale sky was felt differently, not as policy or concern, but as atmosphere. Days felt cooler, evenings came sooner, fires were kept burning longer, cloaks stayed wrapped close. People spoke less of destiny and more of weather, less of glory and more of bread. The contradiction deepened, empire strong above, life fragile below. And this contradiction carried a lesson the sky did not need to speak aloud, that no matter how high walls rise, they remain rooted in soil, that no matter how long laws endure, they depend on harvest, that no matter how vast ambition grows, it cannot command the heavens. Some believe the pale sky was born of distant fires, ash lifted into the upper air, spreading thinly across the world, softening the sun's reach without dimming its face. Others believe it was a natural turning, a slow shift written into the long cycles of the earth. But for those who lived beneath it, cause mattered less than consequence. The consequence was humility, because even empires must wait. In the courts of power, maps were spread across tables, star-marked, inked with borders and routes. Fingers traced lines of expansion and defense. But beyond the edges of those maps lay the same pale sky, uncharted and unmoved. The sky does not belong to empire. It belongs to time. As months passed, the question that lingered was not whether the cities would fall, but how long they could stand unchanged beneath conditions that no decree could alter. The atmosphere remained solemn, not fearful. There was no collapse yet, no burning, no invasion, no sudden unraveling, only the quiet realization, settling like dust on marble floors, that strength alone does not sustain civilization. Warmth does, grain does, the faithful turning of seasons older than stone. This realization did not destroy the empires, it shaped them, it slowed them. It tempered them. It introduced pause where there had once been certainty. And perhaps that pause was the most dangerous thing of all, because empires are built on momentum, on the belief that tomorrow will be larger than today. When that belief hesitates, the foundation trembles, not visibly, but deeply. The pale sky watched patiently. Years later, long after the air warmed again, long after harvests recovered, people would look back on this time and struggle to name it. It would not fit neatly into tales of triumph or disaster. It would live instead as a quiet chapter, half remembered, half felt. A time when the heavens seemed distant. A time when power learned restraint. A time when stone cities stood tall, but listened more carefully to the earth beneath them. And so the final reflection does not rest on ruins. Not yet. It rests on what has not happened. On towers still standing, on laws still spoken, on streets still walked beneath a pale sky. The cities endure, but uncertainty lingers. It settles into corners and crevices. It drifts across council tables and market stalls alike. It waits, like dust, for time to finish its work. Perhaps the empires will adapt and endure. Perhaps they will fracture slowly, guided by forces no one commands. Perhaps they will one day become the ruins others walk through, wondering how such strength could fade. For now, they stand, and the sky remains pale. As your own breath slows, as the weight of the day loosens its hold, imagine those cities beneath that distant light. Solid, quiet, waiting, not in fear, not in triumph, but in reverence for forces older than ambition. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some lessons are taught not through collapse, but through endurance, through standing beneath a sky that no longer favors us, and learning slowly how small even greatness can be. The story begins not in the cold itself, but inside remembrance, inside the low-lit rooms where elders sit wrapped in wool and years, where voices move slowly, like hands tracing familiar paths through the dark. The fire nearby burns low, its flame no longer eager but faithful, Shadows gather on the walls and listen. It is said that when they speak of the long winter, they do not speak as witnesses alone. They speak as keepers, keepers of a season that never truly ended, but learned how to live inside memory. They begin softly, as if afraid the cold might hear its name and return with sharper teeth. They say there were years when winter stopped behaving like a season and became a state of mind. Years when cold was no longer something that arrived and left, but something that stayed, settling into bones, into habits, into the way people thought about tomorrow. In forgotten corners of the earth, the winter stretched beyond its proper borders. Snow did not always fall, yet the chill remained. Days grew pale, nights deepened. The sun appeared smaller, distant, as though seen through frosted glass. Children born during those years learned cold before they learned warmth. Their first memories were of breath made visible, of hands tucked into sleeves, of doors closing quickly behind them. They did not ask when winter would end, because winter was simply how the world was. And those who were older learned something quieter. They learned how hardship becomes story, because the body feels cold only in the moment, but memory carries it forward, shaping how the soul understands endurance. As the winter continued, fact and feeling began to blur. People could no longer say which days had been colder, which nights longer. Memory softened the edges, smoothing sharp moments into something bearable. Pain did not vanish, but it changed shape. The cold became symbolic, a veil drawn gently over joy, a hush laid across celebration, a slowing of life's usual music. Songs were still sung, but more quietly. The melodies stretched, their rhythms unhurried, as if rushing might break them. Instruments were played less often, and when they were, they sounded deeper, weighted by silence. Festivals still arrived, marked by the turning of the calendar, but they no longer blazed. Fires were smaller, feasts were simpler, laughter was softer, shared in close circles rather than shouted across open space, and yet life did not stop. This was not a record of suffering carved into stone. It was a record of adaptation, of how humanity learns to live with less light. People rearranged their days. Work began later, when the faint sun had risen as high as it could. Nights were spent closer together, bodies sharing warmth, voices sharing stories. The world shrank inward, becoming intimate, careful. In this inwardness, memory grew stronger, because when the world outside offers little, the inner world becomes refuge. Elders told stories not only to pass time, but to pass warmth. They spoke of summers remembered, of fields once golden, of birds that sang without hesitation. They spoke of ancestors who endured other winters, other trials, reminding listeners that the present cold was not the first and would not be the last. Whispers tell us that some stories changed each time they were told, not because they were lies, but because memory reshaped them gently. Harsh edges softened, fear became caution, loss became lesson. Over time, the stories no longer sounded like warnings, but like maps, guides for how to move through darkness without losing oneself. The cold in these stories was no longer an enemy. It was a teacher. It taught patience. It taught restraint. It taught the value of waiting without despair. In homes lit by a single flame, children listened wide-eyed, absorbing not just the words but the tone. They learned that survival was not always loud or heroic. Often it was quiet and repetitive. Wake, tend the fire, share what remains, sleep. This rhythm became sacred, and within it joy found new forms. A shared cup of warm broth, a hand held longer than usual, a joke whispered at the right moment, releasing a brief, precious laugh. These small things mattered more than ever. As years passed, the long winter settled into collective memory. People no longer counted its length in months or snowfalls, but in stories. During the cold years, they would say, back when the sun felt far away, memory became the archive where hardship was stored. not to preserve pain, but to preserve meaning, because meaning keeps the soul warm. Some believe that the winter truly ended long before people admitted it, that warmth returned gradually, almost unnoticed, that the sun regained its strength in increments too small to celebrate. Others believe the winter never truly ended at all, that it simply moved from the air into memory, where it still lives, shaping caution, shaping gratitude, shaping how people respond when light falters again. The mystery lies not in what exactly happened, but in how it is remembered. What details were kept, which were softened, which were allowed to fade. Where memory fades, imagination fills the space. And in that space, the long winter becomes something almost gentle. A shared trial that bound people together, a time when silence was not empty, but full of listening. As the chapter draws toward its close, the fire burns lower. The elders' voices slow, words stretch further apart, listeners lean closer, not just for warmth, but for the feeling of continuity, of being held inside something larger than themselves. Outside, the night remains cold. Winter still presses against the walls, but inside there is a different temperature. A warmth made of shared silence, of stories resting where they have been told many times before, of memories arranged like blankets, layered carefully. The fire settles into embers. One by one, voices fade. The story does not end, it simply drifts into sleep. Winter remains, but so does warmth, and memory itself becomes shelter. A quiet structure built not of stone, but of words, pauses, and breath. Perhaps the long winter was never meant to be escaped. Perhaps it was meant to be carried. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And some seasons, once lived through, remain with us forever, not as cold, but as the knowledge that warmth is precious, and silence, when shared, can be enough. A thin curtain hangs across the sky. It is not seen with the eyes, not pointed to or named, yet it is felt everywhere. It softens the light before it reaches the ground, gentles the sun's touch, and turns brightness into something distant, almost remembered. The day arrives, but it does not arrive fully. It feels filtered, as if the world is being viewed through a layer of breath. It is said that this veil appeared without warning. No sound announced it. No edge marked its beginning. People stepped outside one morning and sensed it at once, not as darkness, not as storm, but as separation. The sun rose faithfully, tracing its ancient path across the heavens, yet its warmth hesitated. The air carried a faint coolness that did not belong to the season. Shadows softened, losing their sharpness, as though the world itself had grown cautious. In forgotten corners of the earth, this realization spread quietly. Fields glimmered with light that no longer nourished as it once had. Stone warmed slowly, reluctantly. Even water seemed slower to respond, holding chill longer into the day. The veil was not an object. It was a feeling, a subtle distance between heaven and soil, between cause and consequence, between what should happen and what did. Whispers tell us that people struggled to speak of it at first. Language felt clumsy around something so delicate. They knew the sun was still there. They could see it, and yet they sensed that something stood between them and its full presence, a separation, and separation invites wondering. As days turned into weeks, theories emerged, not shouted, but murmured. They passed between people like shared secrets, carried on low voices and careful glances toward the sky. Some believed distant fires had spoken in secret tongues, that far beyond the horizon, mountains had opened and breathed their ancient dust into the upper air. That ash, finer than flour, had risen into the hidden chambers where sunlight travels, spreading thinly across the world. Others spoke of wounded skies, of invisible scars stretched across the heavens, places where light faltered, bent, or thinned. They imagined the sky itself as something living, capable of injury and slow healing. Still others believed in veils more symbolic than physical, a sacred curtain drawn not by accident, but by design. A reminder placed gently between the world and its source of warmth, asking humanity to notice what it usually takes for granted. None of these explanations could be proven. All of them felt possible, because the veil did not reveal its origin. It offered no story of its own. It simply existed, suspended between sun and earth, like a breath held too long. Beneath the silence, curiosity replaced fear. People did not run from the unknown. They leaned toward it, slowly. They observed how the day unfolded differently, how mornings felt hesitant, how noon arrived without confidence, how evenings seemed to carry a deeper hush. Children noticed first, as they often do. They asked why the sun felt tired, why shadows stayed close, why their breath sometimes appeared even when the sky was clear. Elders listened carefully to these questions, for they echoed something old, something buried beneath layers of memory. Scrolls were unrolled in quiet rooms. Ancient writings were revisited, not as instructions, but as companions. People searched for echoes of similar times, moments when the world had shifted subtly, when the heavens had grown distant. They found fragments, lines describing dim suns, mentions of cold summers, notes of harvests that faltered without clear reason. History did not offer answers, it offered patterns, and patterns invite humility. The veil became a sacred symbol, not of punishment, not of failure, but of mystery. It reminded humanity that the world often changes without revealing its hand. That cause does not always stand beside consequence, that the forces shaping life move through layers too fine to grasp. Under the veiled sky, life adjusted. People rose a little later, waited a little longer, spoke a little softer. Fires burned longer into the day. Cloaks stayed wrapped close even when the sun stood high. The world slowed, not in resistance, but in reverence. In fields, plants grew cautiously, not dying, not flourishing, existing in a careful middle space. The earth, too, seemed aware of the veil. It responded not with collapse, but with restraint. Animals moved differently. Birds flew lower. Herds clustered closer. The rhythms of life softened, as if listening for cues that had not yet arrived. Beneath the silence, the veil taught patience. Because patience is what remains when certainty thins. In temples and open spaces alike, prayer changed its tone. It became less about asking for answers and more about acknowledging mystery, less about summoning light and more about accepting its gentler presence. People learned to live with filtered warmth. They learned that sustenance does not always arrive in abundance, that survival often depends on balance, not excess. That light, even when softened, can still sustain life if met with care. The veil did not starve the world, it tested it, and in that testing something ancient stirred, an understanding that humanity has always lived beneath layers it cannot see, that the sky is not a simple thing, that the sun's journey is longer and more fragile than it appears. Some believe the veil thinned over time, others believe it never truly lifted, only faded from attention as the world adapted. Perhaps people learned to read its presence the way sailors read stars through clouds, not directly but intuitively. The mystery lies in its endurance. How long did it last? Where did it begin? Did it end? History offers no clear markers, only impressions, only the memory of light that felt distant, of warmth that arrived slowly, of a world asked to wait. And waiting, too, became sacred. The veil was never torn away. It was never dramatically removed. It remained unlifted, hovering gently, allowing just enough light to pass through. Enough for crops to grow, if slowly. Enough for fires to burn. Enough for life to continue. Not enough to forget its presence. And perhaps that is its purpose. To remind us that not knowing is not failure. That uncertainty can be a form of wisdom. That some truths are not meant to be grasped, only lived with. As the chapter draws toward its close, the day softens into evening. The sun lowers itself toward the horizon, still pale, still restrained. The sky deepens into quiet color. Lavender, ash, deepening blue. The veil does not move. It remains where it has always been, unseen yet felt, resting between the source of light and the world that receives it. Night arrives gently. Stars appear sharper, clearer, as if the darkness itself has been polished. The moon rises marked by a faint halo, its glow diffused, oceanic, calm. Under this sky, people rest. They no longer search for the veil. They accept it. They breathe beneath it. They allow its presence to teach them something subtle about balance and patience. And now, as your own breath slows, as the edges of thought soften and begin to drift, imagine that thin curtain above you, not heavy, not threatening, just present, filtering light, softening certainty, inviting rest. Perhaps it was never meant to be lifted. Perhaps the wisdom lies in learning how to live beneath it. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some truths arrive not in clarity, but in the quiet peace of not knowing, where memory fades, where breath deepens, and where sleep comes gently, carried on the soft, veiled light of the world. The days began to stretch. Not because the sun lingered longer in the sky, not because light refused to fade, but because waiting filled every hour. Time loosened its grip on urgency. Moments widened, thinning like ice beneath careful steps. The cold did not rush anyone forward. Instead, it slowed the world gently, as if asking it to pay attention. It is said there were years when time itself forgot how to hurry. Morning arrived, but it did not press forward into action. People woke and lay still, listening to the quiet weight of the air. Breath moved slowly. Thoughts did not leap ahead as they once had. The day felt long before it had truly begun. In forgotten corners of the earth, the cold stretched moments thin. It did not sharpen them into pain, it softened them into endurance. Tasks took longer, not because hands were weak, but because purpose had changed. When warmth is scarce and certainty thins, speed loses its meaning. Time began to move differently. Clocks existed, but they no longer ruled. Bells rang, but their authority faded. The familiar divisions, hour, day, week, felt less important than the rhythm of survival. Light and dark mattered. Hunger and rest mattered. The ticking of measured time fell quiet beneath the deeper pulse of being alive. Calendars lost their power first. They hung on walls, their pages still turned, their markings still neat. Yet no one trusted them fully. Seasons failed to arrive as promised. Spring came hesitant. Summer felt borrowed. Winter lingered without asking permission. The future became fogged. People stopped speaking far ahead. Plans shortened. Conversations settled closer to the present moment, where control still lived. Tomorrow was discussed. Next week sometimes. Next year faded into a soft uncertainty. The past, meanwhile, grew heavier. Memories surfaced more often, revisited not for nostalgia, but for reassurance. Elders spoke of years when things had been different, when the rhythm of life had been faster, brighter, more certain. They spoke slowly, carefully, as if time itself were listening. Stories stretched, not because they grew longer, but because listeners leaned into them. A tale told by the fire could fill an evening. A memory could become a shelter. In those moments, time did not pass. It settled. Symbolism gathered quietly. There were no grand clocks here, no towering mechanisms measuring the world. Instead, time was counted by simpler signs. The lowering of the sun, the fading of embers, the last loaf cut into portions. The rhythm of survival replaced the rhythm of ambition. Wake, work gently, wait, sleep, and repeat. This was not stagnation, it was deliberation. The world moved slowly, not because it was broken, but because rushing through hardship would only deepen it. Slowness became a form of care. Each action was considered. Each decision rested before being made. Even speech changed. Words were chosen with more weight. Silence grew longer between sentences, not awkward, but thoughtful. Conversations drifted rather than marched. There was time to listen fully, time to notice breath, time to feel the presence of others without filling the space. The cold encouraged stillness. Stillness altered time. It is said that during those years, people felt as though they were living inside a held breath. The world inhaled and paused, unsure when it would exhale again. That pause stretched, not endlessly but deeply. Belief shifted within that pause. Faith, once tied to certainty and outcome, softened into trust without timeline. Hope no longer demanded quick reward. It learned to exist quietly, without proof. Because when time slows, belief must adapt. Some found comfort in ritual. Simple, repeated actions became anchors. Lighting a candle at the same hour, sweeping the same floor, speaking the same prayer before sleep. These rituals did not hurry time. They marked it gently, like stones placed along a foggy path. Others found comfort in nature's smallest movements. The way frost melted slowly at midday. The way shadows crept instead of leapt. The way stars appeared one by one, unbothered by human impatience. The mystery was not that time slowed. The mystery was what that slowness revealed. Without the rush toward the future, people noticed how much of life had been spent anticipating rather than inhabiting. They felt the weight of each moment more clearly, the ache, the warmth, the presence. Suffering did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became something that could be carried, not fled, something that demanded patience rather than resistance, something that asked the soul to widen instead of harden. In this altered time, joy appeared differently too. It arrived quietly without spectacle, a shared smile, a warm bowl held in both hands, a moment of laughter that surprised everyone by existing at all. These moments felt longer than they were, because time, when slowed, gives space to meaning. The days continued. They did not resolve themselves. They did not rush toward an ending. They simply unfolded, one careful layer at a time, like a scroll unrolled by unseen hands. People stopped asking when things would return to normal. Normal had loosened its hold. Instead, they asked gentler questions. How do we move through today? How do we keep one another warm? How do we endure without losing ourselves? And in asking those questions, time found a new rhythm, not faster, not slower, deeper. As the chapter draws toward its close, we arrive at a single moment, one that exists between markers, neither day nor night, neither beginning nor end. The sky is dim, but not dark. The sun has slipped low, yet the stars have not fully claimed the heavens. The air is still, breath rises and fades. Everything pauses. In this suspended moment, time neither advances nor retreats. It rests. It acknowledges the pause it has taken, the lesson it has offered, and then quietly, almost unnoticed, it begins to move again. Not as it once did, changed by the stillness. Time resumes its quiet flow, carrying with it the memory of slowness, the knowledge that rushing is not always required, that endurance has its own pace. The world does not snap back into urgency. It moves forward gently, bearing the imprint of the pause like a fingerprint on glass. And now, as your own breathing slows, as thought loosens its grip on before and after, you may feel that same suspended moment settling around you. Neither day nor night, neither effort nor rest, just presence. Perhaps time was never meant to be conquered or escaped. Perhaps it was meant to be listened to. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And some pauses, once lived, change the rhythm of everything that follows, guiding us softly out of urgency and into sleep. And the warmth returns quietly, so quietly that at first no one is certain it is real. The morning opens as it has for many days before, pale sky, familiar horizon, the same cautious light. But somewhere between breath and thought, something shifts. The air rests more gently on the skin. Stone does not feel quite as cold beneath the hand. A thin softness moves through the world, almost like recognition. It is said that when the light remembered us, it did not announce itself. There was no sudden blaze across the heavens, no cry of relief rising from the fields. The sun simply rose and lingered. Its presence felt fuller, steadier, as if it had found its way back along a path long forgotten. People stepped outside and paused, not in celebration, not in disbelief, but in careful listening. Because trust, once thinned, does not rush to return. In forgotten corners of the earth, the day unfolded with a gentler rhythm. The light reached further into shadow. It rested longer on rooftops and roads. It touched faces with something like warmth, not memory. Breath no longer clouded so readily. The air held a promise it had not spoken in many seasons. Still, no one named it aloud. The world had learned patience. Some believe the first signs appeared in the fields. The soil, long restrained, began to soften. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to be noticed by those who had pressed seeds into the ground year after year without certainty. Fingers sank slightly deeper. Earth crumbled with a sound that felt familiar, almost forgotten. The fields began to breathe again. Green did not surge, it crept. Shoots rose cautiously, as if unsure whether they would be welcomed. Leaves unfolded slowly, testing the air. Growth returned not as triumph, but as question. And the earth answered itself quietly. Birds returned in the same way, not in chorus, not in flocks darkening the sky, but one at a time. A single call, tentative, from the edge of a tree. A flutter of wings crossing a field at dusk. A shadow moving against the light, alive and uncertain. The birds did not sing immediately. They watched. They waited. It is said that the birds remembered what the world had forgotten, that survival teaches caution, even in abundance. As days passed, more voices joined the air, songs grew longer, mornings filled with sound again, not the same as before, but close enough to ache. The silence did not vanish, it stepped back, allowing music to share the space. Memory lingered like a scar. The world did not forget the long dimming, it carried it forward, woven into behavior, into habit, into reverence. Fires were still kept ready, stores were still measured carefully. Gratitude grew where assumption once lived. Because light, once withdrawn, is never taken lightly again. The sun felt sacred now, not because it had changed, but because the world had. People no longer assumed its faithfulness. They noticed it. They felt it on their faces and paused. They lifted their eyes more often. They spoke of it less, as if naming it too loudly might break something delicate. In temples and homes alike, prayers softened into thanks. Not dramatic, not overflowing, just steady acknowledgement, the kind that does not demand explanation. Because no answers arrived, no scroll revealed why the sun had dimmed, no voice from the sky explained the veil, no certainty descended to close the question. And somehow, that was enough. The mystery remained intact, respected. Some believe the cause was distant fire, long settled. Others believe it was a turning written deep into the earth's long memory. But belief mattered less than presence. The light was here. That was enough. Children born after the dim years grew into a world that felt warmer than the stories they heard. They listened to elders speak of pale skies and cold noons, of quiet fields and absent birds, and these tales felt unreal, like dreams half-remembered, yet the caution in those voices shaped them all the same. They learned that survival is not loud, that recovery does not erase memory, it absorbs it. Fields grew fuller, but never careless. Harvests returned, but were still shared with deliberation. Celebration returned, but carried softness at its edges, as if joy itself had learned humility. The sun crossed the sky each day, stronger now, more confident. Yet it did not blind. It warmed without demanding attention. It felt kind. As the seasons turned, The world found its rhythm again, not the old rhythm, but a new one shaped by endurance. Time moved forward, but carried the pause within it. Light moved freely, but carried shadow as companion. And then, as all days do, this one began to close. The sun lowered itself gently toward the horizon. Its light deepened, rich and golden, touching the land with care. Fields glowed softly. Stone walls held warmth. Birds settled into evening quiet. The world exhaled, not in relief alone, but in gratitude. Because survival had not come with certainty, it had come with patience. And patience had taught the world how to receive light differently. The sun set warmly, without drama. Its farewell was gentle, almost tender. Darkness followed, but it no longer felt like threat. It felt like rest. And in that resting, the chapter ends, not with answers, not with closure, but with sacred uncertainty. The knowledge that survival is fragile, that light can leave and return, that when it does, it carries forgiveness in its warmth. Perhaps it was never meant to be fully understood. Perhaps the meaning was always in the waiting, and in the quiet gratitude when warmth finds us again. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some light, when it returns, does not ask to be explained, only to be received. As sleep approaches now, let that warmth remain with you, not bright, not demanding, just present. A reminder that even after the longest dimming, the world can remember how to glow, softly, patiently, and whole once more.